The political leader of Hamas assassinated in Iran, a senior Hezbollah commander killed in Lebanon, and 2 Al Jazeera journalists struck down in a targeted attack. After killing almost 40,000 Palestinians in Gaza, can Israel continue without accountability? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. Events are fast unfolding involving Israel. Events that seem to cross new boundaries, dangers and horrors daily. A former Palestinian Prime Minister, Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh, assassinated in Iran. He was the man leading the Hamas side in negotiations towards a ceasefire in Gaza and the release of Israeli captives. In Lebanon, a country scarred by decades of attacks by its southern neighbour, Israel killed Hezbollah's senior commander Fuad Shukr. And journalists again targeted by Israel. Al Jazeera correspondent Ismail Ghoul and cameraman Rami Al-Rifi, the latest, killed by a missile strike in Gaza. The Israeli army has killed nearly 40,000 Palestinians since the war began in October. The 2.3 million people of Gaza try to survive in appalling conditions. Homes and buildings flattened, vital infrastructure such as hospitals and water supplies obliterated. As the world looks on, Israel ploughs on. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu fated with more than 50 standing ovations in the US Congress as he is wanted for war crimes by the International Criminal Court. Are there any limits on what Israel can do, armed as it is with Western weapons and political support? And will there ever be accountability for its actions? We'll be discussing this with our guests in just a moment, but first a report from Victoria Gatenby.
Allahu Akbar. Allah!
Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei holds funeral prayers for the political leader of Hamas in Tehran. Iran blames Israel for the killing of Ismail Haniyeh and says it will avenge his death.
The
time for the occupation to attack without response is over. They've done something and they must pay the price. They must be held responsible. America is responsible for this. No crime is committed by the occupation without the criminal America.
Haniyeh was assassinated in a missile strike in Tehran on Wednesday, hours after an Israeli attack on the Lebanese capital Beirut killed senior Hezbollah commander Fuad Shukr. A day later, the Israeli army announced it had eliminated the commander of Hamas's military wing, Mohammed Deif. It says he was killed in an attack on a building in the Haniyeh area of southern Gaza 3 weeks ago. Israel's also been targeting journalists throughout the nearly 10 months of war. Al Jazeera correspondent Ismail Ghoul and cameraman Rami Al-Rifi were killed in a strike on their vehicle near Gaza City on Wednesday, even though they were clearly marked as members of the media. Israel has killed more than 160 journalists in Gaza since October. At an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council, the United States called for de-escalation. America is Israel's biggest ally and supplies it with weapons worth billions of dollars.
Mr. President,
but Palestinians say the actions of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu prove ending Israel's assault on Gaza is not a priority.
Every day brings more horror, loss and suffering for our people as Israeli occupying forces massacre Palestinian civilians, assassinate officials, kill humanitarian workers, medical personnel and journalists, abduct civilians and torture and rape them in Israeli jails.
Israel's war has killed nearly 40,000 people and injured another 90,000. Homes and hospitals have been flattened, and food, water and medical supplies are scarce. Tensions in the Middle East are running high, and many fear the fighting could escalate into a full-blown regional conflict. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Bring in our guests for today's discussion from Los Angeles. We're joined by Mehran Kamrava, a professor of government at Georgetown University in Qatar. He specialises in Iran, the Gulf and Middle East politics. From Belfast, we're joined by Beverley Milton-Edwards, the co-author of Hamas, The Quest for Power, and a former EU special advisor to the Middle East peace process. And from Dur Shweya in Lebanon, Karim Makdisi is a political analyst and associate researcher at the Arab Council for the Social Sciences. Welcome to you all. Let's start with you, Karim. Is Israel out of control, or does it know exactly what it's doing, deliberately pursuing military objectives according to a planned strategy?
Yes, hi. I think it's both. I think they are out of control in the sense of they're trying to kind of create a situation in the region in which they remain in charge of what's going on, in which they are able to create all sorts of violence, assassinate at will, blow civilian infrastructure at will, continue the genocide in Gaza, take on Iran, take on Lebanon, take on Iraq and Yemen and other countries in the region, and not really necessarily understand what the repercussions are going to be. On the other hand, I do think that there is a strategy there. I think the strategy, especially with Netanyahu having just come from the United States, is to try to push as much as possible to create this kind of atmosphere in the region in order to draw the Americans in, and in order to kind of scupper any kind of ceasefire talks and ensure that they can, in their own terms, sort of win the war in Gaza and kind of keep not just the deterrence in the region, but to kind of keep the regional hegemony going.
Beverley, what might Iran's response to the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh on its soil look like? The retaliation from the so-called axis of resistance?
Well, I think as compared to the retaliation that took place in April by Iran following the attack on one of its assets in Damascus by Israel, we will see a difference. Certainly what we're going to see is a more immediate response. That's already been headlined, which means that the kind of signalling that took place in April simply won't occur. In April, the missiles, drones that were sent from Iran were mainly directed at Israeli military targets. Now, there are certainly fears that this time Iran will also put in its target sites parts of the Israeli civilian infrastructure, including, for example, its ports, maybe in Haifa or Ashdod, as well as energy installations. Moreover, I think we're already seeing that this is going to be much more of a sort of coordinated effort involving other members of the axis of resistance, which means that, again, Israel is threatened from the south by the Houthis, from the north by Hezbollah, with a sort of expansion beyond what's been considered the grey zone of targeting in northern Israel into deeper and perhaps even more strategically sensitive sites. And of course, there's also a sort of heightened risk of further retaliation and coordination of retaliation in the Gulf area. So once again, maritime assets, supply routes and energy routes from the Gulf to the rest of the world fall into those target sites. So there's an awful lot to be worried about there.
Mehran, would Israel have had US logistical support or help from anyone else for the killing of both Haniyeh in Tehran and Shukr in Beirut? Or does it have the military and intelligence capabilities to act alone? Would the US have known in advance about the attacks? I mean, the US at the moment saying publicly that it didn't, but if it didn't, what does that tell us about the relationship between Israel and the US?
That's an excellent question. What we've seen is that the Israelis have been repeatedly acting unilaterally without American advanced knowledge. And I think the Americans, I take their word for it this time when they say they didn't know about this in advance, because no doubt the Americans would have vetoed it, knowing the Iranians would escalate. I don't think the escalation would be as extensive as Beverley just mentioned. I think it would be proportional. No one other than Netanyahu wants to escalate the war beyond the tragedy of Gaza, except Netanyahu, who wants to prolong his own political career. But, you know, one of the things we're seeing here is a really odd US-Israeli relationship unfolding. On the one hand, the Republicans have embraced Netanyahu wholeheartedly and unconditionally, while on the other hand, the State Department has been more measured. Certainly, there have been defections and resignations in the State Department. So we're seeing a really odd dynamic here unfold, and it'd be interesting to see how that relationship evolves under a possible Harris presidency or a Trump presidency.
Mehran, I'm just interested to know whether you think the political situation in the US right now is having any impact on Netanyahu's current thinking. Is he perhaps escalating to ensure that should a less sympathetic president take the White House, or win the election in November, take the White House from January, that their hands are tied as far as the conflict is concerned?
Absolutely. The narrative here in the United States is completely pro-Israel. It's almost as if the genocide in Gaza doesn't exist. It's really amazing how there's any pro-Palestinian sympathy here or empathy for the plight of the Palestinians, given the dominant narrative in the public domain, in public spaces, on mainstream American media. And the Israelis have been brilliant at framing the narrative in a way that casts them in a completely positive light, as if Netanyahu and his cabinet can do absolutely no wrong, as if the Palestinians don't matter, Palestinian lives do not matter. And so I think what we're seeing is really the PR machine that the Israeli government has at its disposal here in the US in full force in operation.
Karim, does Israel's policy of assassination against leading figures from the Palestinian resistance achieve anything? It's extrajudicial murder. Has it improved Israeli security over the years? What does it mean for the chances of peace talks succeeding right now? And, of course, Israel's aim for freeing hostages. Why does Israel continue to pursue this policy?
No, I think to answer your question, I don't think that the assassinations, which, of course, Israelis have been doing for decades, has improved their security at all. It hasn't improved anybody's security. Haniyeh himself is a result of, he came into power, and others like him as a result of the Israelis killing all sorts of other Hamas leaders over the years. Hassan Nasrallah himself has come because others before him at Hezbollah were assassinated. So, as has been said quite a bit, it's the idea of resistance, the idea of Hamas itself and Palestinian resistance, Palestinian liberation, Palestinian self-determination. In Lebanon, it's as well. It's resistance. It's fighting against occupation and Israeli attacks all the time. In the long history of invasions and occupation, this stuff will always outlive particular leaders and particular people that they get assassinated. It doesn't mean that in kind of operational terms they're not valuable and that they don't cause problems. Of course they do in the field and in the actual war planning. Of course they do, but it will certainly not stop the kind of the overarching kind of resistant movements that's happening across the region. And what we can see now, which is an increased coordination across this kind of axis of resistance across the region. So you can see from Yemen to Lebanon, there's several fronts, but they're all acting more or less in unison and quite coordinated. So no, of course, Israeli security doesn't improve, but more importantly, you don't get Palestinian liberation. You don't get people, civilians across the region, in the Arab lands, in Lebanon and Palestine, across the region. Nobody, people are suffering. And it's not just about Israeli security. Nothing will happen as long as Israelis continue their genocide and their occupation and their series of assassinations, all of which is basically to try to stop any kind of negotiations from taking place. And I think this is the key issue. Do the Israelis get to continue with impunity, to continue to assassinate Palestinian and Lebanese leaders and resistance fighters and get away with it on the international level? This is the key question. And as far as I can see, and as Mehran was saying earlier, the kind of support that the US has given without any reservation at all on Israeli action has been astounding. And that's been very well noted across the region here. And it does nothing, or it does nothing. It makes American standing in the region much worse and makes everybody's security much worse. And this is something that cannot be stopped.
Beverley, do you agree with that? Is Israel blind to the consequences of its actions? Or does it feel emboldened to behave as it does? This incremental ramping up of acts which breach both international and humanitarian law because of the apparent unconditional support of the US?
Well, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. I think that whilst Mehran has pointed out that Israel does appear to be in sort of one body acting with impunity, I think we need to take into consideration that there are a number of tensions and forces at work in Israel and in the body politic at the moment. So to be realistic and to bear in mind that this is a asymmetric conflict, an asymmetric war that's being waged here, and as has been done for decades now. Israel, if the right kind of covert intelligence and security opportunity presents itself, Israel, particularly under the government of Netanyahu, has never failed to act swiftly to execute the kinds of assassination attempts, successfully or otherwise, in the past, as we saw with Ismail Haniyeh this week. And again, as we saw when Netanyahu first came to power in 1997, when he attempted to assassinate Khalid Mashal, who will be the likely successor of Ismail Haniyeh. And on that occasion, of course, Israeli agents, the Mossad, failed in Amman. But that was, again, it's all about is the opportunity there for them to execute the kind of assassination and tactics of assassination that they choose to constantly pursue. Now, as we've all acknowledged, this doesn't actually get Israel, the Israeli people, the Palestinian people, or any other actors in the region any closer to peace. And by any measure of attempts to achieve conflict resolution or confidence building momentum, this is no way an achievement in terms of the future prospects and hopes for the release of Israeli and other nationalities being held hostage in Israel, or for those 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza having any form of alleviation of the absolutely dire humanitarian conditions that they're suffering in. I think that Mehran's quite correct to point out that this is a bit of a blow for US leverage in the wider Middle East. It's certain from what we've been hearing from Washington in the last 48 hours that Israel simply didn't bother to consult or to cooperate or to engage in the usual routes of intelligence sharing with their partners in the CIA or the FBI. Now, let's read that against the cooperation that had been going on the mediation file for a ceasefire and for hostage releases, where the CIA, Mossad, through the mediation of countries like Qatar and Egypt, and of course with Hamas negotiators, Ismail Haniyeh included, were progressing. So what we're seeing here is that, again, just to re-emphasize the point, that within Israel itself, we're seeing really serious tensions domestically between the political leadership and the kind of constraints or lack of constraints that Netanyahu believes it with his coalition partners, who are a bunch of extreme right-wing racists, that they will do one thing, and that the military, defense, security, and intelligence community may on occasion be advising other things.
Beverley, let me just jump in there, because I want to bring in Mehran and pick up on something that you were saying earlier, and Mehran, that you said in a previous answer. To what extent is the continuation of the war and the dangerous moment that we find ourselves with it threatening to metastasize into a wider regional conflict purely down to Netanyahu and his need to stay in power, as you said, in order to avoid having to appear in court on corruption charges? I mean, is it really that simple? Or are other personalities within the right-wing Israeli government and military also driving this? The man is not a dictator. He's a democratically elected prime minister. It can't all be about his ego, can it?
Yes and no. There are indeed pressures on Netanyahu from even to his right to eradicate any trace of Palestinians in Gaza and then probably in the West Bank. I think you're absolutely right. It is there are Israeli political dynamics at work, but we've all known that Netanyahu's political career has been in danger for some time now. In fact, in many ways, October 7th came to his rescue. Let's remember that there were weekly massive demonstrations in Tel Aviv and elsewhere in Israel against Netanyahu for the judicial reforms he was trying to push through the Israeli political arena. And so I think in many ways the prime minister continues the onslaught on Gaza and on Palestinians in order to prolong his own political career and to keep both the right and the left flanks of his coalition in check.
Karim, will Israel ever be held to account for its actions, for the thousands of innocent people slaughtered in Gaza, for the targeting of my Al Jazeera colleagues, for the journalists who've died in Gaza? And how important will accountability be in any resolution to this conflict?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think that's something that there's not going to be accountability anytime soon for the Israelis until or unless resistance works. It's relying on Western states and Western institutions and Western politicians and leaders is not going to get any kind of redress for the Palestinians, either in terms of their long struggle for self-determination and liberation, or for trying to get individual Israeli leaders held to account. Each time there's a push for that kind of issue, it gets stopped somewhere along the line. We see now this incredible case at the International Court of Justice. You see this incredible presentation by South Africa, by Namibia, by other states in the global south that have been joining in on this. And you see the pushback by countries like Germany, by the UK, and certainly by the United States to try to block this kind of international process of accountability. Same is happening at the International Criminal Court. The kind of accountability that will happen once the world realizes that someone like Netanyahu, and here I disagree a little bit with Mehran, in that I think the focus on Netanyahu, of course, he has a personal interest. It's true, he has personal interest to try to prolong this war, but I think it's really important to remember that Israel as a whole, as an entity, as a state, as backed by an ideology of Zionism, a political project of Zionism, has been like this, was created with ethnic cleansing in 1948 in the Nakba. It has not stopped this from day one, from its existence until today. So what we see in Gaza today, in the genocide, what we see in the attacks across the region, is a continuation of a long history of what the Israelis and what Zionism is about, and what the Israeli state has been about from the beginning. So yes, there are personal issues with Netanyahu himself in terms of what he can get away with, in terms of his pushing it, but it is something in which Israel as a state has long been doing.
Beverley, we're rapidly running out of time. I need a brief answer, about a minute and a half from you, if I can. Where does this leave Qatar? You mentioned Qatar, which had been mediating in the ceasefire talks, and the governments of the wider Middle East and the Gulf. I mean, how will Israel's targeted killings impact upon their response to this crisis?
I think the response has already been clear for Qatar and its mediators, Egypt and other actors in the region, which is that they want de-escalation. They have called for accountability. They have made a very strong point of reminding the rest of the world that so long as Israel continues to act outside the international norms and outside international consensus and the morals and ethics of the conduct of diplomacy, then the world is truly threatened, not just the region by an escalation, but the rest of the world. And coming back to the International Criminal Court, it's very important to still remember that, an application has been made. Each one of those arrest warrants is a separate warrant against each one of those individuals. And we're yet to hear from the judges about the issuing of those warrants. And again, it's very important to remember that others are being investigated, and we can only hope that justice truly will prevail.
Mehran, Palestine's representative at the UN told the UN Security Council that, quote, violence and terror are Israel's main and only currency. There is no red line for Israel, no law it will breach, no norm it will not trample, no act too depraved or barbaric. And yet the world stands idly by, time after time, wringing its hands as people die. Israel is in breach of international law. It ignores UN resolutions and ICJ orders and is accused of committing genocide. Arrest warrants are expected to be issued for its Prime Minister and Defence Minister by the ICC. Why on earth does the world continue to tolerate this from Israel?
That's an excellent question. Partly is because of the narrative, the fact that for so long, for so many decades, the world has been conditioned, particularly the West, has been conditioned to view Israel as right and the Palestinians as having been being wrong, and so of course the narrative is such that the public narrative is such, the public discourse is such that it's the average American person doesn't hear about Palestine, doesn't care about the Palestinian, the average Palestinian person or their plight, and I think it's very difficult to argue with the very eloquent statement of the Palestinian representative to the United Nations. I think she was quite right.
Karim, final word to you then. And we must be brief. We've got about a minute left. Rami Khouri, who you'll know and our viewers will know because he appears on Inside Story regularly, called Israel a zombie killing machine that the world doesn't quite know what to do with. Why doesn't the world know what to do with it?
It's very simple in this sense. So first of all, of course, I agree with him totally. The United States has not reined it in. The United States and its Western allies have allowed Israel over many decades to act with total impunity for invasions, occupations, apartheid, genocide. This is no longer in dispute anymore. Israel has lost its global legitimacy. The resistance movements across the region are growing. Public opinion across the Arab world, contrary to the leaders, is very much against normalization. And everybody wants to push for this question of justice for Palestinians and for people, for peace, for people across the region. This can't happen as long as the United States in particular keeps backing Israel to the hilt, keeps sending weapons, keeps supporting it in the international fora, and doesn't allow the most basic accountability. Resistance will continue, and it's going to be the only way forward. Not Western-based kind of accountability. It'll be accountability from people in the region until the Israelis understand that they have to coexist in equality and peace, rather than, as Rami said, this kind of zombie-like killing machine, which is their entire history as far as the entire neighborhood is concerned, especially the Palestinians, and especially now as we're seeing in Gaza.
And there, I'm afraid we must end. Many thanks indeed to all of you, Mehran, Kamrava, Beverley, Milton-Edwards and Karim Makdisi. Thank you for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can join us at our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can join the conversation on X, our handle at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha. See you again. Bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.